Welcome back to week 6, the last week, sadly. But yeah, you can't get rid of me. I'll do something in the spring, for sure. This is too much fun. Okay, so today we started the class with the American Revolution. I've brought us up to the Civil War. We'll talk a bit about the war and about the period afterwards, which is known as Reconstruction. There are more books about the Civil War than any other single topic in American history, and people are writing them all the time. So there's a lot of information out there, and I cannot possibly do justice to the topic in the time available, but I'll cover it at my usual superficial level. Okay, so the war starts. We had the attack on Fort Sumter, and what do the two sides think they can accomplish? And so this map kind of explains what the war strategies were for either side. The North intended to apply what was known as the Anaconda strategy. They were going to surround the Confederacy and squeeze it to death. And the surrounding included a naval blockade, so that the U.S. Navy was going to prevent ships taking cotton somewhere where they could sell the cotton and buy weapons. The one idea was they were going to control the Mississippi River and then move east, and they were going to come down out of Kentucky. And amazingly, Richmond is less than 100 miles from Washington, so both sides had an incentive to try to figure out if they could cover that distance and capture the other capital. So one part of the Union strategy was, of course, to march down on Richmond. The South had more of a defensive strategy. They wanted to defend their perimeter, and they had some dreams of invading through Maryland into Pennsylvania, but mainly their goal is to just drag the thing out until the North gets sick and tired of fighting, which is a strategy we talked about with George Washington during the Revolution. If you're the weaker side, that is something you can try to level the playing field a bit. So that was the Southern strategy. Right after Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Got some recruiting posters here. At the time, he thought that might actually be enough to get to Richmond. He also suspended what's called habeas corpus, which is a fancy legal term for the process that if the government arrests you. Yes, I did not make that announcement. Could we turn off our phones, please? That's okay. I didn't even bring mine today. Okay, so habeas corpus is the procedure. If the government arrests you, it is a vehicle for getting a court to determine whether you're being held illegally. By suspending habeas corpus, Lincoln and the Union Army could arrest anybody suspected of being a Confederate and lock them up indefinitely. They would have no way to appeal from that. There we go again. Okay, so because Lincoln's got the volunteers, Richmond's pretty close. So in July 1861, an U.S. Army marches down toward Richmond. There was a much smaller Confederate army waiting for them, and they met up at a creek called Bull Run near the town of Manassas Junction. They're only 30 miles from Washington for this one. And in fact, the battle is so close that spectators came down from Washington to watch the excitement. Members of Congress, their families, a lot of wagons, a lot of horses, people deciding they're going to watch the fun. The Confederates were outnumbered, but as so often the case, they had better strategy and better generals, and they managed to hold off the Union. One of the men on the Confederate side who was leading the defense and refusing to cave in under the Union pressure was Thomas Jackson, who acquired the nickname of Stonewall at this battle because somebody said, "Look, Jackson's men, they're just standing there like a stone wall," meaning the Union was just bouncing off them and unable to pass. And then the Southerners counterattacked. The Union Army panicked. All the spectators panicked. And so you can imagine a mad rush to get back up to Washington where they might be safe. That defeat really shook up Congress and it took several steps to push the war forward. First thing it did was to issue what was known as a War Aims Resolution. This is what we're fighting for. And I put it up there, and you may notice that all they're saying is that they are going to try to preserve the Union, bring the southern states back, but they are not going to tamper with any institutions in the southern states. In other words, at this moment, this is not a war fought to get rid of slavery. It was a war fought to bring the Union back together. Congress also authorized Lincoln to raise an army of 500,000 men, and it passed our first national income tax. 3% if you earn more than $800, 5% if you earn more than $10,000. Congress also passed a Confiscation Act, which is basically any property of a Confederate that the Union Army seizes, the Union Army is going to take home with it. They're going to confiscate everything, and that the property for this purpose included slaves. So wherever the Union Army went, it was in a position to basically liberate the slaves who were there and often turn them into people helping the army with, building camps and that sort of thing. There wasn't much fighting for the rest of 1861. The North was scared, and the South had no particular incentive. They could just keep waiting to see what would happen next. The first really big battle of the war happens in April 1862 at a town called Shiloh in Tennessee. And as I mentioned, one part of the Union strategy was to send an army from Missouri and Kentucky, which were technically slave states but had not joined the Confederacy, come down from there and invade Tennessee. The Union Army bumped into a Confederate army at Shiloh, and the Union Army was led by Ulysses S. Grant. You of all people, Arlene? I can't believe it. All right. So that picture on the left, that was a forest that was part of the battlefield, but there were so many bullets that you can see what happened to the trees. It is no longer a forest. Grant won and pushed the Confederates out. A total of 24,000 men were killed or wounded in 2 days. That is the same as the Revolutionary War, which took 7 years. This is the first time that the scale of the fighting begins to set in on people. Up until this point, the Union just assumed that the Confederates were a lot of kind of lazy cavaliers who sat around and drank mint juleps. And the Southerners thought that the Union were hopelessly inadequate, and that Southern gallantry and Southern pride would be well enough to defeat the Union Army. So they both have unrealistic views of each other, and they both, like World War I, they both think it's going to be over soon, but it's not. A couple of months later, a Union Army led by General George McClellan, that's him on the upper right, sails down the Potomac, lands at the base of a peninsula between the James and York Rivers, and decides to march up and try to get to Richmond from that direction. He was out-generaled by Robert E. Lee there and Stonewall Jackson. He did get pretty close to Richmond, but they kept holding him off and then drove him all the way back down the peninsula. So they all eventually, after a few months, McClellan and his men got on the same ships and sailed back up to Washington. It was a complete failure. A couple months after that, Lee decides to invade the North. So he takes his army and moves into, he's heading toward Maryland. He's in Western Virginia at the time. And McClellan got his army there just in time, and they met up at Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg. This is the bloodiest battle yet. This is 25,000 people killed or wounded in one day. Lee was forced to retreat, and that meant that this bloody battle was perceived as a victory for the North. You start having photos of the dead, battle dead now, and you can see, there's endless amount of them out there available on the internet. I found a couple. Lincoln went to visit the troops, so that's him in the upper right, and he's the tallest one there, and he has the tallest hat, so easy to spot. Now, the fact that this was perceived as a Union victory gave Lincoln a chance to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which he had been waiting for the right time to issue. Now, it's important to understand that Lincoln was much more concerned about holding the Union together than he was about ending slavery. And he actually, toward the beginning of the war, he told Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving the others alone, I would do that too. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union." Now, by September of 1862, Lincoln had come to the conclusion that proclaiming emancipation would help the North win the war. He thought it was a political necessity for a couple of reasons. He hoped that turning emancipation into a major war aim would kind of inspire the North and turn the war from a Northern perspective into a crusade for liberty. He also wanted to discourage the British from providing support for the Confederates. So if you remember, the South grows a lot of cotton, and an awful lot of it went to Great Britain and its textile mills. And the British didn't much care at first who won the war, but they had an economic incentive to have the South continue to provide cotton. So Lincoln and his advisors looked for ways to try to make sure the British would stay at a distance and not help the South. And they thought turning this into a crusade for emancipation would do that. So there's Lincoln. I should have put that slide up while I was explaining his rationale. And there is the Emancipation Proclamation in his handwriting and a news account of it. It was freedom for all the slaves in the rebel states as of January the next year. It exempted, there were 4 loyal slave states. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't touch any of the slaves in those states, and there were over 400,000 of them there. It also didn't cover parts of the South that were occupied by the Union Army. What it basically did was it applied to slaves where the North could not enforce it. Only the areas that were still under active resistance, but where the Union Army hadn't gotten there yet. That sounds really weird, but it was a reflection of what Lincoln thought his powers as the president were. As much as you might want to do something under our system of government, the Constitution has to give you the power to do it. And it wasn't clear that a president could just start taking away people's property whenever he, which is what, on one level, the slaves were. And Lincoln thought that his powers only covered the putting down an active rebellion, which meant the areas that were still safe from the Union Army for the time being. Lincoln also approved the recruitment of free blacks to join the Northern Army. I found some nice photos of these guys. Frederick Douglass helped to recruit, and in fact, 2 of his sons were among the very first to enlist. Now, black soldiers received lower pay and had to pay for their own uniforms, which the whites did not. One of the early regiments, remember, racism is everywhere in this period, even among white people who sort of want to help or do want to help slaves. Racism is everywhere. One of the main black regiments was the 54th Massachusetts. There's some of them lined up at the bottom there. They were, of course, commanded by a white person, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. That's him in the upper right. The man in the center is William Harvey Carney, who was a member of the unit and was the first black soldier to be awarded the Medal of Honor. In one encounter with the South in the battle, the person holding the North American flag got shot. The flag's about to fall to the ground. Mr. Carney gets there, catches it before it hits the ground, and brings it safely back to the Union side. That was considered a very brave thing that he did. He got an award for it. Now, there's a memorial to the 54th down in Boston Common. They moved it. It's now kind of opposite the State House. But if you look closely, what this is a monument to Shaw, Colonel Shaw. This is not technically a monument to the 54th. They're there, but the heroic figure on horseback is the guy that the sculptor Auguste Saint-Gaudens, if I'm mangling his name, but sadly, I mean, it says something. Overall, 180,000 black men fought for the North. 10% of a total men who took up arms for the North. 1 out of 5 of them got killed. They fought valiantly, but in 1865, when it was time to have the victory parade in Washington after the war was over, the black troops were not allowed to march in the parade because it was considered the sight of all those black men with rifles was thought to be a little too inflammatory for a white audience. 1862 ended with a real disaster for the North. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, General Ambrose Burnside, there he is. There are his sideburns. He is indeed the man who gave us that term. People following the Army, I guess, thought it was a clever, you reverse his name and you get sideburns. So he might have had a great facial hair, but he was not a great general. And he led a frontal assault across the Rappahannock River, trying to get to Fredericksburg. The South under Lee were lined up at the top of the hill, and the Union followers got mowed down as they tried to climb up the hill. It was a terrible disaster. The North lost twice as many men as the South did. Lincoln told an aide after this battle, "If there is a place worse than hell, I am in it." Beginning of 1863, Congress decides we need a draft and passed a draft law that applied to all men between 20 and 45. This is truly a poor man's war. If you paid somebody to substitute for you, you didn't have to go. If you simply made a donation of $300, you didn't have to go. Less than 25% of the people who were drafted actually served. The spring of 1863, things get even worse for the North. Now the guy in charge in Virginia is Joseph Hooker. He tries to take the town of Chancellorsville. Lee is outnumbered 2-1, splits his army, defeats both parts of the Northern Army. Second bloodiest battle yet at 30,000 casualties. And one of them was Stonewall Jackson. He got shot by his own men by mistake and died a few days later. Now, the draft law is supposed to go into effect at the beginning of July 1863, and there were anti-draft protesters back then. And in fact, there were 4 days of rioting in New York City, primarily by Irish laborers who knew that they would be the ones drafted and sent to fight. They couldn't buy their way out. So part of the protests were attacks on the rich. Anybody who looked too well dressed and was out on the street ran the risk of being beaten up. The Irish attacked draft offices, but within a day or two, the rioting against the draft morphed into rioting against black people. The rioters didn't feel like going to war to help black people who would then compete for their jobs. You know, the Irish laborers are worried about their own survival. They don't see any reason to go down to Virginia, fight for slaves. So they don't. And they started attacking black people on the streets. The upper right there, they also burned to the ground the Colored Orphan Asylum. That's it in flames. It took 20,000 U.S. soldiers to put down the rioting. Overall, 120 deaths were reported to the police. 106 out of 120 were black. There were also, of course, many other deaths that never got reported to the police, so we don't know the total, but it is clear it is the worst rioting in American history. By a remarkable coincidence, just as this is happening, the North finally has an opportunity to celebrate two big victories. Right there at the beginning of July, Grant is trying to get control of the Mississippi River. And the Northern armies had captured most of it. The one part that they hadn't gotten to was the town of Vicksburg, which sits high up above the river and was very fortified, had lots of cannon, and controlled the Mississippi. Northern ships were at risk if they tried to sail past Vicksburg. But it was the way it was, up on a hill and fortified, Lincoln didn't think a direct attack from the river would work. So what he did is he floated his army downriver at night, and somehow the Southerners up on the ramparts didn't see all these boats with Union soldiers heading down below them. Once he got below Vicksburg, he landed on the eastern side, marched up, and surrounded Vicksburg. And it was a siege for several months. Finally, the Vicksburg, it was terrible living in that city during the siege. They were out of food. So in July, on July 4th, the Confederates surrendered. He took 29,000 Confederate prisoners. So he not only, now the North controlled the complete Mississippi River, but it also was a big blow to the Confederate Army. Exactly the same time, at the beginning of July, Lee again decides to invade the North, thinking that he can cause enough trouble that Congress will want to back off. So he crossed into Pennsylvania with 75,000 men. An army under General George Meade, an army of 90,000 from the North, came up after him, and they collided at the town of Gettysburg. 3 days of fighting. The most famous event that people remember is Pickett's Charge, which was a Southern cavalry charge on the Northern position. That on the lower right is the ground that Pickett had to cover. They started from where the photographer was. They were trying to get to the trees up at the top of the photo, and the Northern soldiers were all behind a stone wall right there at the trees, just waiting for them. And Pickett lost 60% of his men just trying to get across. They had 60% killed. This is the bloodiest battle of the war, more than 50,000 men killed or wounded. That is the same as all of American wars up till that date combined. The Revolution, 1812, and the Mexican War. Lee lost 1/3 of his army. The Union lost 1/4, but they had a lot more men. As part of his retreat, while they're on their way, Lee says to one of his advisors, "It's all my fault. I thought my men were invincible." And given the record he had, out-generaling one Union army after another, he had some reason to be cocky about it. But in this case, it didn't work. In November, Lincoln came to deliver an address at Gettysburg. That's his handwriting of what he was going to say on the left, Executive Mansion stationery. And on the right is apparently the only photograph there is of Lincoln at Gettysburg. He has taken off his hat. So that's why you may not recognize him. But the people who have studied that photo carefully are pretty sure that fellow with the high forehead and inside the red circle, that's Lincoln. His speech took less than 3 minutes. It's sort of only in retrospect did it assume the grandeur and importance that it got. Now, after Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln concludes the only general he's really got who seems to know what he's doing is Ulysses S. Grant. So Lincoln puts Grant in charge of the entire Northern Army. And Grant has a two-part strategy. He is going to build as big an army as he can get and then march into Virginia to get Richmond. And an army from the west under General William Tecumseh Sherman, which may be one of the greatest names in American history. William Tecumseh Sherman would take his army and march across Tennessee through Georgia and get to the Atlantic. So Lee took a very large army, came down from Washington to try to get around Lee's army, and as you can see from the strange arrows on this chart, Grant kept trying to go around him to the left. Lee kept maneuvering to prevent him, and they keep hopping, you might say, down through Virginia, and finally, at the end of the summer, Lee's army holed up in the town of Petersburg, and at that point, the battle becomes a siege. There were 100,000 casualties in 6 weeks, but the North lost twice as many men. But on one level, Grant didn't care because he had more men. Winning was what mattered. So there's now a siege at the end of the year, going into the winter. There's a siege at Petersburg. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman there is taking his army from Tennessee down across to Georgia. Sherman told Grant, "They cannot be made to love us, but they can be made to fear us." And his strategy was to not only cover the ground, but totally demoralize the Southern civilians in his way. He lived off the land. This is the first time, really, that a large army went off on a march without bringing its own supplies. Sherman just figured he'd get what they could find on the way. They captured Atlanta, in September of 1864, got to Savannah at the end of the year. Those are a couple photos of Atlanta, which was quite demolished. At the end of his adventure, Sherman boasted that his army had destroyed 400 miles of railroad, had burned millions of dollars of cotton, and had eaten enough food to feed Lee's army for 6 months. Devastating attack. Now, remarkably, this is America. Every 4 years in November, we have to have an election. In November of 1864, there was an election. The Republicans, of course, renominated Lincoln, and to try to emphasize the unity of the northern side, they picked Democrat Andrew Johnson for vice president. Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. He was the only Southern senator to stay with the Union, which was a brave thing to do for him. Their platform was winning the war at all costs and a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. Now, the poster on the right there is a Democratic poster. The Democrats picked Union General George McClellan. Now here you have a general running against his former commander-in-chief, which is kind of weird. But the Democrats' platform included 4 years of failure. And seeing as how McClellan had contributed more than his share to that failure, it's a kind of ironic platform. And they also played the racist card. And I don't know how well you can read the small print, but they're referring to Lincoln as the black Republican ticket. And they say a vote for Lincoln means Negro equality and universal anarchy. McClellan did manage to win 3 states. But obviously Lincoln won. By the spring of 1865, I'm so sorry, the Confederacy was pretty clearly doomed. Lee was outnumbered 2-1. Grant had 120,000 men. Lee only had 55,000. They were as I mentioned, they spent the winter in Petersburg, but in the spring, Lee's army managed to escape from Petersburg and started heading west. Grant's army went after him, and they caught up with him at the little town of Appomattox. And by that point, Lee realized to spare the rest of his men, it was time to stop. So he asked for the chance to surrender. That house in the upper right is where they signed the papers. The painting is one of the many imaginary visions of what it might have looked like. As soon as this news arrived, Lincoln actually went down to visit Richmond. He toured Richmond, and nobody took a shot at him, which is really kind of amazing. But unfortunately, there was somebody else who had a different plan. On April 11th, 1865, Lincoln gave a speech at the White House to a crowd of cheerers, and he mentioned the possibility of giving black soldiers who fought in the Union Army the right to vote. Oh, thank you. John Wilkes, yep. That's John Wilkes Booth up there on the left. He was a very well-known actor from Maryland. He was in the crowd when that Lincoln gave that speech, and Booth turned to a friend of his in the crowd and said, "That means nigger citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever make." And now, some historian with a magnifying glass managed to discover that at Lincoln's second inaugural, there on the lower left, Booth is in the crowd. He's looking down from his circle down on Lincoln giving his inaugural speech. That is actually a very big photograph. I don't know how anybody spent the time to recognize that face, but it pretty much is clearly Booth. So a couple days later, April 14th, as we all know, Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater to watch a comedy. Booth managed to get his way up to the booth where they were sitting, sneaks in from the back, shoots Lincoln in the head. Lincoln died the next day, and as I mentioned, a newspaper reporting all that is on the back table if you want to look at it on the way out. So why did the North win the war? I think there are several pretty obvious reasons. It had more men that it could put in uniform. The Union was a much stronger economy, so the Union could borrow money and tax people, whereas the Confederacy had to resort to printing Confederate dollars, which became pretty much worthless by the end of the war. The North had all sorts of other advantages in industry and transportation. And then you think about all the battles. If you went to tour Civil War battlefields, other than Gettysburg, they're pretty much all in the South. So the southern countryside, southern civilians, life has been really torn up for them. The human cost of the war, those are some figures. More than 1 in every 5 soldiers died. A lot of them died from disease because military camps were incredibly dangerous. There were a lot of germs. This is 50% more casualties than the United States had in World War II. And in World War II, the United States was 4 times larger. So I'm not going to, there's a ratio in there that I can't come up with right this minute, but as a percentage of the fighters, this is way the bloodiest war in American history. Besides killing a lot of people, the war made some significant changes in American society, North and South. For the first time, the national government experimented with some things that we have all come to know and love, like the draft and an income tax. And the U.S. government also printed its own money. They became known as greenbacks because of the green ink that the Secretary of the Treasury decided to use. And then, of course, the impact on the South is just profound. Emancipation, it has to be at the top of the list. Think of the change that means. 25% of the white men in military age were dead. Nearly half the livestock is gone. Without slavery, you can't really have plantations in the old sense. So Southern agriculture is transformed, and basically the people who used to work on plantations are now sharecropping or tenants on the same land if they chose to stay in that area. For several generations after this war, the South was all agricultural, very poor, and voted Democratic, to the point there used to be the expression, the solid South, which was the Democrats could always count on all the states of the old Confederacy. At the same time, the North is getting more and more rich, more and more industrious, and the North is voting Republican. So the country becomes two different worlds after the war, somewhat mirroring the difference before the war, except the South is a lot poorer now than it had been. So what does Reconstruction mean, which is the next topic? How do you put the country back together? That's the question. And it had a few specific parts to it. What do you do with all those Confederate soldiers and all those Southerners who served in the Confederate government? Do they just get to go back to life as usual, or does something have to happen to them, some sort of punishment? What do you do with the Southern states? Do they just get to show up at the next Congress, or do you have to have some procedure before you'll let them back in? And what do you do with the former slaves? There were two basic approaches to Reconstruction. Right after the war, Andrew Johnson adopted a pretty generous approach that Lincoln would have adopted and had already sketched out. Johnson gave a full pardon to anybody in the South who would take an oath of allegiance to the federal government. There were just a few exceptions for the very top Confederate officials and the very top generals. And those people got individual pardons later on. Johnson also said Southern states could come back to the Union as soon as 10% of the men signed that oath. 10% is a pretty low percentage. And Johnson had no interest in any special protection for the former slaves. In fact, he owned 3 slaves himself and fathered a daughter by one of them. And the woman's name was Dolly, and that is a photograph of her with their child. The Republicans in Congress wanted something much, much tougher before they were going to let the South come back in. And the first thing they did was a constitutional amendment to get rid of slavery once and for all. So it passed at the beginning of 1865 and took effect at the end of 1865. If you saw the movie Lincoln, back 2012 with Daniel Day-Lewis, who won an Oscar, the centerpiece of that movie is the debate in the House of Representatives about whether to pass the 13th Amendment or not. And the big celebration at the end of the movie is when the House finally succeeds in passing it. Congress also created an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau to try to help the ex-slaves. And in theory, it sounded pretty good. It was going to provide food and shelter. Initially, it was going to help them get their own land by dividing up the plantations, which would have been revolutionary. And it also helped build schools like the one in the lower left of the slide. But Congress didn't provide much funding, and of course, Southern whites considered the whole thing to be a disgraceful boondoggle. It's hard to see that cartoon on the right, but that is a very lazy black person relaxing while small figures of Southern whites do all the work. So that's a racist take on what the Freedmen's Bureau was going to do. At the end of December 1865, Congress reopens, and all the Southern states start sending their people. You know, senators, congressmen, and the vice president of the Confederacy showed up. Several of the top generals showed up, and the Republicans just simply locked the doors on them. No Southerners coming back in until we make a few more changes. The people running the Republican Party at that point were Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts on the left. He had finally recovered from the caning that I mentioned to you last week, which kept him out of the Senate for 3 years. And the man on the right is the leader in the House of Representatives, Thaddeus Stevens, from Pennsylvania, played by Tommy Lee Jones in the movie. And in the movie, he smiles, but in this photograph, Stevens looks like a man who has never smiled in his life. They were determined, and one of the things they were focused on is the Southern whites didn't just sort of give up. As soon as the war was over, by the fall, Southern legislatures with white people in them started passing laws to restrict what black people could do. They became known as black codes. Every black person had to have a written contract of employment. Blacks could only work as farm laborers or household servants. Any idle or disorderly conduct could be punished by forced labor. It's pretty much the goal of the Southern legislatures was to recreate slavery as close as they could get. And the Republicans in Congress wanted to do something to stop all of that. The first thing they did in April of 1866 was to pass a Civil Rights Act, and I've quoted some of the key language there. The point is that black people and white people should have exactly the same legal rights and the same legal protection. But the Republicans were somewhat worried that this Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. I go back again to what I said before about Lincoln. Congress has to have authorized power in the Constitution in order to do something. And civil rights, this bill doesn't quite look like regulating commerce or any of the other things that Congress can clearly do. In the 1960s, this would be regulating commerce, but not back in the 1860s. So Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which is the single most important amendment in our history. The first section of it does a number of very important things. Anybody who is born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. And if you remember, Roger Taney and the Supreme Court said black people, by definition, could not be citizens. This part of the 14th Amendment overrules Dred Scott. Also, the amendment prevents states from abridging the privileges and immunities of U.S. citizens, which sounds wonderful, but within a few years, the Supreme Court defined privileges and immunities as so small a category that part of the Constitution had really no effect at all. It's the last part that has generated certainly more litigation than anything else in the Constitution. I think it's fair to say. A state cannot take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you think of all the definitions in there. I mean, executing somebody would be life, but how about interfering with some of the things someone wants to do? Life, liberty, what's property? What counts as property? What in the world does due process mean? The courts have been very busy trying to figure this out, and it has kept a number of happy lawyers employed with all the litigation. And similarly, a state cannot deny equal protection of the laws. Again, lots and lots of litigation about what that truly means. But that's not all that the amendment did. In the next section, it said if a southern state prevents black men from voting, the southern representation, that state's representation in the House will be reduced by the percentage of black people who can't vote. So it's a penalty on continuing to disenfranchise black men. And then the third clause, which frankly I had never thought of until recently, nor has probably anybody else in the country. If you violated your oath to support the Constitution by engaging in an insurrection or rebellion, you can't be an officer of the United States again. Now, obviously, there's plenty of litigation that's going to end up in the Supreme Court this year about whether that applies to Trump. He seems to have held an office. He certainly did swear an oath to the Constitution. I heard him swear it. And whether he engaged in insurrection or rebellion is, that's a tough one. I don't know how a court is going to come down on that. There's plenty of arguments in favor, but he didn't show up at the Capitol himself to lead the charge. So it's a little hard to know. Now, Congress also passed Reconstruction Acts to try to use the U.S. Army to control the southern states until they had done the things they needed to do, like ratifying the 14th Amendment. And the Republicans in Congress also decided they wanted to get rid of Andrew Johnson, who was vetoing all sorts of things. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act. They had to pass it over his veto. So they set him up. The Republicans in Congress passed a law saying that the Senate had to approve it before a president could get rid of somebody in his cabinet. That had never been the rule before. Presidents had fired people in their cabinet ever since George Washington. But suddenly, Andrew Johnson couldn't do that without the Senate's approval. It was intended to lure Johnson into a confrontation, and he obliged them by firing the Secretary of War. The House voted for impeachment. The trial took place in the spring of 1868. If you were a lucky person, you could have had one of those tickets of admission on the upper left. The vote was 35-19 in favor of convicting Johnson and removing him from office, but they needed 36 votes to convict. They were one short. And so Johnson stayed in office for the rest of the year. Until the election of 1868, the Republicans naturally picked the most popular war hero in the country, Ulysses S. Grant. The Democrats picked the governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, and as you can see, Grant won quite easily. On his way out the door, Andrew Johnson issued a general amnesty. Anybody left in the Confederacy who wasn't already readmitted on good terms was readmitted, and that even included Jefferson Davis, which when you think about it, it's kind of amazing that somebody didn't put Davis on trial as the president of the Confederacy and hang him. It was sort of unfair because he didn't want to be president of the Confederacy, but somehow he managed to escape and was living quietly, and then Johnson gave him a full amnesty. Some of white abolitionists by the later 1860s thought that their job was done. William Lloyd Garrison published the last issue of his abolitionist newspaper at the end of 1865, and he says the object for which it was started has been accomplished. Slavery not only has been abolished by the war, but also by constitutional amendment. What a grand and sublime triumph. Frederick Douglass had a very different view. Frederick Douglass said at the same time, slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Political power is going to be necessary for the Southern blacks to survive. There were plenty of white vigilantes like the Ku Klux Klan trying to prevent black men from voting. Congress, that's the amnesty. I should have clicked before that. Not that you're expected to read it, but there it is. So to try to help protect black voters in the South, who they were sure were going to vote Republican, the Republicans in Congress passed another amendment, the 15th, to make sure that just because you had once been a slave, that didn't mean you couldn't vote now. And just because of your race, that you can't be excluded. Each of the Congress was requiring, as part of Reconstruction, that every Southern state adopt a new constitution with universal manhood suffrage. And at first, lots and lots of black men voted, and a lot of whites stayed home, and black men were elected to some pretty important positions. The man on the upper left there is Hiram Revels. He was the first black to be chosen for the U.S. Senate from the state of Mississippi. He had an interesting career. He had been born free in the state of North Carolina. He had moved to the Midwest where he was a minister. He had helped organize regiments of black soldiers and during the war, and he was an Army chaplain. And overall, 16 black men were elected to the House of Representatives over the next several years. Slowly but surely, Southern whites are starting to regain political control. There was amendments on the books supposed to protect the rights of blacks to vote, but the U.S. Army wasn't doing a whole lot to enforce them. As it turned out, whites in the North didn't really care about black voting either. I mean, how is this for hypocrisy? The 14th Amendment will take away seats in the House if a southern state prevents blacks from voting, black men. 9 states in the North and Midwest prevented black men from voting at exactly the same time, including Connecticut and New York. But the Republicans in Congress had no intention of applying the 14th Amendment to themselves. Grant was reelected easily in 1872. The Democrats nominated Horace Greeley, who was the nation's best-known newspaper editor. Grant gets a huge majority. Greeley died just a few days after the election, and so the Democratic electors threw their votes in all sorts of different directions, which is why the map looks kind of curious. The story of the 1876 election is going to sound kind of familiar in a strange way. The candidates in 1876 are Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. He's there on the left. He was a former Union officer who had been wounded 4 times during the fighting. The Democrats picked the governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, who was a very accomplished attorney and had also prosecuted public corruption cases in New York. There were many Republicans who were worried about corruption within the Grant administration, and I don't have time for it, but the Grant administration set new records for political corruption, people taking bribes in order to sell off government property. Grant was really the leader in the clubhouse until Warren Harding, who then set new standards, which were surpassed by Richard Nixon. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So there was more skepticism on the Republican side, and the election was extremely close. Tilden won the popular vote by 250,000 votes. It's a pretty good margin. He had, when the dust settled the next day, Tilden had 184 electoral votes, but he needed 185. And there were four states that were in dispute. Sound familiar? Oregon, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana were all in dispute. Now, in fairness, there was plenty of fraud in this election on both sides. Whites in the South prevented many black men from voting Republican, but Republican officials in the North threw out an awful lot of Democratic ballots. I mean, there was cheating on both sides. It's ugly. Congress sets up an electoral commission to try to resolve those disputed states. And initially, there's supposed to be 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 Supreme Court justice who did not have a political affiliation. So that sounds fair, except at the very last minute, that Supreme Court justice resigned, and they had to pick another person, and they chose a different Supreme Court justice who happened to be a loyal Republican. And so when the commission voted, it was just what you would expect. 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and here are a couple of political cartoons. You've got, on the left there, you've got Tilden crying because Hayes has stolen his toy. And the one on the right, Hayes is walking out of the ball with a beautiful lady, and Tilden is looking quite sad because she's ignoring him. I think he's actually begging from her. I think he has a cup. Now, the Democrats did not take this lying down. The Democrats threatened to go on strike in Congress. They would not cooperate with anything unless the Republicans made them an offer. And so the Republicans did. They worked out a deal. Hayes promised to appoint a Democrat as Postmaster General, which sounds ridiculously trivial today, but back then, remember, the post office was the main source of political patronage jobs. So a Democrat was going to be assigning all those jobs. The Democrats wanted that. And the other thing that the Republicans agreed to do was to withdraw all remaining U.S. troops from the South. This compromise of 1877 is the unofficial end of Reconstruction, because without federal troops to help them, the blacks in the South were on their own, and there wouldn't be anybody to protect their interests if whites started discriminating, attacking them, preventing them from voting, murdering them, all of which was happening. After emancipation, most of the ex-slaves stayed in the South. And in some places in the South, they were more than 75% of the population. This is a county map, so the red is areas where black people were more than 3/4 of the population. Most of them went to work on the former plantations as sharecroppers or tenants. Most of them fell into debt very quickly because they had to borrow money for the seeds and supplies they would need, and each year they had to pay some of it back, but they ended up borrowing more. It wasn't slavery, but it's a pretty tough way to live, being a Southern black sharecropper. And this is in a period where the Southern whites haven't not yet come up with Jim Crow and legalized segregation. So if the plight of blacks in the 1880s was difficult, it was going to get worse in the 1890s. Now, I want to close with a few remarks about what happened next. I am bound to run over a little bit, but I hope you'll bear with me. Between the Civil War and 1900, the United States embarked on a really impressive period of industrialization. Just a few random statistics. The American economy is growing by leaps and bounds and coming closer and closer to matching Great Britain, which at the time was the leading economic power in the world. New sources of energy, like oil and electricity. New technologies, including consumer goods like the telephone and the record player. Giant corporations like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel. It's a really prosperous time, and if I were doing a class on the last portion of the 19th century, there'd be a lot of material about just how great things were becoming for a lot of people in the country. But because I tend to end these classes on a downer, I think it's important we remember the people who were being left behind by all that progress. I'm thinking of the black and white sharecroppers in the South who were really poor. Factory workers in the North living in tenements, and then the next wave of European immigrants who show up starting in the 1880s. Those people all live difficult lives in real poverty. And then there are the American Indians. The Republicans wanted to encourage Western settlement because they thought that the frontier would be a good place to send surplus labor. Like there'd be less danger of white workers in the streets protesting or striking if some of those guys went west and ended up out on the frontier. So it was a safety valve kind of theory. They helped promote westward expansion by authorizing a transcontinental railroad. And there's the famous photo when the two lines met at a promontory point in Utah. And there was a huge, they didn't just build that line, they funded lots of railroads. And by the 1880s, you have three main ways of going all the way across the continent. Now, with all those railroads, one effect is you can raise cattle in places like Texas and then drive those cows up to the railroads in places like Kansas. This is right after the Civil War, is the golden era of the cowboy. Lots of ranches in Texas, lots of cowboys driving the steer up to the various depots in Kansas where they all get shipped to the Chicago stockyards, which was the slaughtering capital of the country. In 1866, some brilliant person invented the refrigerated railroad car. And suddenly it was much easier to ship meat to the East Coast cities, because had a better chance of being fresh. The railroads also made it more profitable to do mining in the Rockies, because it would be easier to get what you mined out to markets. Just before the Civil War, gold was discovered near Pikes Peak in Colorado. Silver was discovered near Virginia City in Nevada. After the war, there were more and more discoveries. And I hope you can see the colors on that map, but the gold is obviously where gold deposits were found, and the purplish is where silver was found. Between the cowboys, the railroads, all these miners, you have more people farming in the Great Plains or grazing their cattle on the Great Plains. You've got railroads cutting across the prairie, and all of this has a terrible effect on the American Indian tribes who were living there. Their society depended on the buffalo. It is estimated that in 1870 there were 8 million buffalo out there. For the next 20 years, the U.S. Army and white tourists on railroads took it upon themselves to slaughter the buffalo, just for fun. That photo on the lower left, those are buffalo skulls, piled up so high that that guy's standing on the top. On the right, those are buffalo hides. There was some economic value to the hides, but basically this is just a slaughter for sporting purposes. It is estimated that in 1890, so that's 20 years later, instead of 8 million, there were less than 500 buffalo. Gone. And what that does to the Indian tribes who had been relying on them for food and for clothing and all kinds of stuff, it was terrible. More and more tribes were forced onto reservations, but on occasion the Indians fought back. And one of the occasions was the Sioux War in 1875, 1876. Up until then, white people had been prepared to leave the Indians alone in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. But then somebody found gold. As soon as they learned there was gold out there, then lots of whites started showing up to try to take over and mine the gold. Crazy Horse on the upper left and Sitting Bull on the lower left organized a resistance of 4 different tribes: the Sioux, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. And they fought back rather successfully for a while, including the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where pompous General George Armstrong Custer and 270 of his soldiers were all killed. That's the spot on the lower right there. And I guess some of them were buried on the spot. But the U.S. Army kept up the pressure, and 5 years later, the Sioux had to surrender. Now, some of the time, the U.S. Army just went out on a killing spree. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but one of them was the Sand Creek Massacre. The U.S. Army, for no good reason, attacked a Cheyenne village in eastern Colorado and slaughtered 130 men, women, and children. That's a painting of what it might have looked like as the Union fellows on horseback start surrounding the village and shooting at it. It's a National Historic Site, as you can see on the bottom. And there's a tombstone of a Cheyenne girl who got killed on the spot. The end of the Indian organized resistance is another massacre at Wounded Knee in December 1890. The Army surrounded a reservation in South Dakota there. That's the reservation on the upper right before it was attacked. The Union Army demanded that the Indians surrender all of their guns, all their rifles. The Indians refused because they used them for hunting. At that point, the U.S. troops opened fire and slaughtered 150 men, women, and children. That is one of the casualties. This is December in the Dakotas. It is wicked cold. And that is a wounded person who froze to death in the lower left. And what you've got on the right there is the excavation for a mass grave. And you don't ordinarily think of the United States as a place that has mass graves. But sadly, there are a few, and this is one of them. By 1890, all the tribes left and west of the Mississippi had been forced onto reservations or into what was then called Indian Territory and what eventually became Oklahoma. I don't know if any of you have ever driven through an Indian reservation out there, but I was in Phoenix and once had a rental car, so I went on a little trip. And the land that got left aside for reservations is land that white people didn't want because it had no economic value. And the particular reservation I drove through, at least, was as dry as could be. I don't know how anybody could have lived there. All right, so a couple of final thoughts, if you'll indulge me. I think what have we learned? What have we learned from this? Well, I think the Civil War shows us what can happen when two regions of the country disagree about something that is really, really important to them, and when they decide that they don't want to work together anymore. And on one level, today's divisions are worse. I mean, in the 1850s and 1860s, there was one primary issue by far, and that was slavery. But today, the two halves of the country, seems to me, disagree on all sorts of things. Cultural, moral, political. And all right, so that's the last electoral college. That's 2020. There is a geographical difference that you can see. If you consider that it's not clear to me that Georgia is a reliable blue state, or that Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado are reliable blue states. If you take them out, you have a remarkable regional difference, right? The fringes of the country are blue, and the mass of the country in the center and south is red, in our current lingo. And a lot of those people, as far as I can tell, some of those people in the red states down there like Texas really don't want to have a national government at all. Now, at some point, are they going to start loading the rifles that they no doubt carry with them? Are they going to load them? I don't know. Someone I had dinner with recently traveled south, and he was in Louisiana where he saw this bumper sticker. The score is North 1, South 0. It's halftime. Okay. So on that cheerful note, I mean, how bad is it going to get this year? I have no idea, but I am scared to death. And on that cheerful note, thank you all very much.